Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a question today that challenges a lot of the baseline assumptions we make about early childhood development.
Yeah, it really flips the script on how we look at growing up.
Right. Because if you think back to the mechanics of learning to string sentences together or just decoding text on a page,
You tend to view that process as just a standard developmental milestone.
exactly, just a routine part of growing up. But the material we are analyzing today suggests that the specific ways we learn to speak and read as kids actually dictate the entire trajectory of our lives.
And we are not just talking about academic performance here.
No, not just getting good grades in English class. We are looking at the direct correlation between early language acquisition, long-term mental health, individual resilience, and, well, ultimately, whether a person ends up navigating the justice system.
Which is a profound shift in how we categorize these skills. Because historically, educational systems have compartmentalized reading and language strictly as academic competencies.
Just subjects on a report card.
Exactly. But the research we are exploring today forces a reevaluation of that framework. It positions language and literacy not as school subjects, but as fundamental pillars of a person's psychosocial well-being.
And when those foundational pillars are unstable,
The structural integrity of a person's entire life path is severely compromised.
so, to understand the mechanics of the shift, we are focusing our deep dive today on a Wikipedia article. It details the career of a remarkable Australian researcher and clinician, Pamela Clare Snow.
A truly fascinating figure in this space.
Our mission today is to map out her career and unpack exactly why her research into language disorders and early reading instruction is causing such a massive ripple effect.
Across education, public policy, and the legal system.
Right. And to comprehend how she arrived at these conclusions, we have to start by examining her educational background because it is incredibly rare to see this specific cross-section of academic disciplines in one single researcher.
Her foundational training is absolutely key to understanding her later impact. Most professionals in academia or clinical practice, they specialize deeply in a single lane, and they just stay there.
Right, they pick a track.
Yeah. You have speech-language pathologists who focus intently on the mechanics of communication, articulation, phonological processing, receptive and expressive language development.
The physical act of communicating.
Right. And then, in entirely separate departments usually, you have clinical psychologists who specialize in the internal mind, behavioral patterns, emotional regulation, psychiatric vulnerabilities.
But Snow's background merges these historically isolated fields.
It does.
And the timeline of her education illustrates that merger perfectly. She started with a Bachelor of Applied Science in Speech Pathology, paired with a graduate diploma in communication disorders from the Lincoln Institute of Health Science.
Which eventually became part of La Trobe University in Australia.
Yes, La Trobe. And then she spent the 1990s pushing into the neurology of it all. She completed her PhD at La Trobe in 1997 with a specific focus on acquired brain injury.
A really intense clinical focus.
Right. And then the very next year, in 1998, she secured a graduate certificate in higher education from Monash University.
Building that academic foundation.
Exactly. And to round out that dual lens we were just talking about, she officially became a registered psychologist in 2003.
Okay, let's unpack this. Why does this specific combination of degrees matter so much?
Well, by mastering both speech-language pathology and psychology, Snow built a completely unique diagnostic toolkit. She wasn't satisfied just analyzing the physical mechanics of speech.
And she wasn't content just looking at behavioral psychology either.
Right. She recognized that to truly understand human vulnerability, you have to understand both the hardware of neurological communication and the software of psychological behavior.
The clinical experience with acquired brain injury seems particularly telling here.
Oh, absolutely. When you study patients who have suffered severe neurological trauma, you observe firsthand how the sudden loss of language drastically alters a person.
It changes their whole personality. Their social integration, their emotional stability, it is all tied to language. And it is a very short conceptual leap from observing the devastating effects of lost language in adults.
To questioning the developmental impact on kids.
Precisely. Children who never properly acquired those language skills in the first place. That dual focus is what allows her to observe a child acting out in a classroom and recognize that the root cause might not be oppositional defiance.
It might be an underlying, undiagnosed language processing deficit.
Exactly.
That brings us to how she translated those clinical insights into systemic change. Armed with this multidisciplinary expertise, she spent a decade working in medical education at Monash University from 2005 to 2015.
Eventually becoming an associate professor there in 2009.
Right, but the pivotal transition happened in 2015. That is when she returned to La Trobe University as a full professor.
And this is the crucial part. Instead of remaining siloed in a clinical or medical department, she situated her work squarely within the School of Education.
Yes, the School of Education. And 5 years later, in 2020, alongside Tanya Seri, she founded the Science of Language and Reading Lab.
Better known as the Solar Lab.
The Solar Lab, right.
What's fascinating here is why moving into the School of Education is such a critical shift. She effectively shifted her operational model from reactive to proactive.
How so?
Well, think about the traditional role of a clinical psychologist or a speech pathologist. They're typically deployed after a problem has been identified.
Like when a kid is already struggling and gets a referral.
Exactly. They are treating individuals who have already fallen through the cracks of the system. But establishing the Solar Lab within an educational faculty means she is taking all of that clinical data regarding human vulnerability.
And injecting it directly into initial teacher education.
Yes, she is addressing the issue at the source by altering how the next generation of educators are trained to understand and teach language.
It is the absolute definition of moving upstream. If you want to mitigate the downstream consequences of language disorders, you don't just hire more clinicians to treat adults.
No, you equip the frontline workers.
The teachers. You equip them with the evidence-based strategies they need to prevent those cracks from forming in the first place.
The Solar Lab really acts as a bridge between the highly technical findings of cognitive science and the daily realities of classroom instruction.
Which is so needed.
It is, because teachers are often the first and sometimes the only professionals in a position to identify a language disorder before it snowballs into a larger psychosocial crisis.
But they can only do that if their university training actually provided them with an accurate understanding of how the brain learns to process written and spoken language.
Exactly.
When you realize that poor reading instruction or missed language deficits can spiral into a psychosocial crisis, it completely contextualizes the most compelling aspect of her research.
The justice system connection.
Yes. The source material highlights her extensive work linking language disorders in vulnerable children and adolescents directly to subsequent mental health struggles and youth offending.
She is effectively documenting a pipeline.
A direct pipeline that runs from early classroom struggles straight into the juvenile justice system. She studies how children and adolescents are interviewed as witnesses, as suspects, and as victims.
Not to mention her work on treatment and rehabilitation after traumatic brain injury in these populations.
Right. And the environment of the justice system alone is designed around complex, high-stakes communication.
Think about the intense cognitive and linguistic demands placed on anyone interacting with law enforcement or the courts. You are asking individuals to parse dense legal terminology,
Process rapid-fire questions under extreme stress.
regulate their emotional responses,
Mhm.
and articulate a coherent chronological narrative of events.
For a vulnerable teenager with an undiagnosed language disorder, that environment is essentially a setup for failure.
Complete failure. They might have a deficit in receptive language, meaning they struggle to process and comprehend what is actually being asked of them.
Or a deficit in expressive language.
Right, meaning they lack the vocabulary and the structural skills to articulate their internal reality. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains so much about youth interactions with authority.
Because when an adolescent is in a high-stress confrontation, whether that is with a police officer, a judge, or even just a school administrator,
And they lack the linguistic capacity to explain themselves. The external manifestation of that deficit rarely looks like a learning disability to the untrained eye.
it looks like an attitude problem.
Exactly. It manifests as a physiological stress response. The teenager might shut down entirely, become completely uncommunicative, offer single-word answers.
Or react with physical frustration and anger.
Yes. And to an observer who does not understand the nuances of language disorders, that lack of communication is easily and disastrously misconstrued as contempt.
It gets categorized as bad behavior, uncooperativeness, or even evidence of guilt.
And that misinterpretation is the exact mechanism that accelerates a vulnerable teen deeper into the justice system.
The system demands compliance through communication.
And when the individual cannot meet that demand, they are penalized for it.
So early intervention in reading and language is not merely an educational goal. It is a critical public health and social justice intervention.
It is about equipping kids with the self-advocacy tools required to survive in a society that relies entirely on complex linguistic exchanges.
And viewing early literacy as a protective shield like that completely reframes the urgency of educational methodologies.
It raises the stakes.
Massively. If a child's long-term freedom and mental health are tethered to their ability to read and communicate, then the methods we use to teach those skills in early primary school become a matter of profound ethical importance.
Societal importance, really. And this understanding is the driving force behind her intense public advocacy regarding reading instruction.
Which is a huge defining feature of her professional footprint. The Wikipedia article notes that she is a highly vocal participant in what are commonly referred to as the reading wars in Australian schools.
For those of you following the nuances of educational policy, you probably know this debate centers on the most effective methodologies for teaching initial reading.
Right. And based on the source material, Snow is a staunch advocate for explicit, systematic phonics instruction.
She argues that early literacy must be grounded in decoding skills and phonemic awareness.
Ensuring that children are taught the specific relationships between letters and sounds, rather than relying on whole language guesswork or cueing systems.
And her stance is rooted in the cognitive science of how the human brain actually acquires written language.
Because spoken language is natural, right?
Yes, spoken language is a biological adaptation. Children will generally pick it up through immersion in a language-rich environment, but reading is a relatively recent human invention.
The brain is not hardwired to read.
It is not. Therefore, she argues, it requires explicit, structured instruction to map sounds to symbols.
Now, on the flip side of that advocacy, she's also a prominent critic of educational approaches that she identifies as lacking empirical scientific backing.
She doesn't hold back.
No, she doesn't. The source material specifically highlights her criticism of the Aerosmith program. Just to give you some context on her critique, the Aerosmith program is an educational approach based on the concept of neuroplasticity.
It essentially claims that specific cognitive exercises can rewire the brain to overcome learning disabilities.
Right. But Snow has been highly vocal in her criticism of this and similar programs. Her position is that they divert vital time and resources away from the evidence-based explicit reading instruction that struggling students actually need.
Now, our goal here isn't to take a side or litigate the educational debate itself.
No, definitely not. We are just reporting on her stances. But it is important to highlight that her willingness to publicly scrutinize high-profile educational programs is a core component of her career.
And that willingness to step out of the academic silo and engage in public debate is so crucial. Academic research, no matter how rigorous, often remains trapped behind paywalls.
Or buried in dense journals that the general public never ever sees.
Exactly. Snow recognized that if the goal is to dismantle the pipeline between poor literacy and the justice system, the research has to be accessible to the people making the daily decisions.
The parents, the classroom teachers, the local school boards.
Right. And she bridges that gap directly through her blog.
The Snow Report.
Yes, the Snow Report. It serves as a vital translation mechanism. She takes highly complex data regarding cognitive load, orthographic mapping, and language processing.
And distills it into actionable, accessible language.
She writes with the specific intent of reaching an audience outside the ivory tower. By translating this research, she empowers parents to ask informed questions about the curricula being used in their local schools.
And she provides teachers with the scientific rationale they need to advocate for better instructional materials.
This raises an important question, though. It challenges the public to develop a critical eye toward educational programming.
How so?
It prompts us to consider how much educational theory or institutional practice is accepted simply because it has always been done that way.
Or because it sounds intuitively appealing in a glossy brochure.
Exactly, rather than because it is backed by robust, peer-reviewed cognitive science.
And holding institutions to a standard of evidence like that requires a certain level of academic authority. When you look at her career, her authority in this space is heavily documented.
It really is.
We have to examine her influence within the academic publishing sphere because it is extensive. She actively shapes the discourse in her field.
She has served as an editor for the journal ACQ.
And she acts as an editorial consultant for the International Journal of Speech-Language Pathology. Furthermore, she sits on the editorial board of First Language and serves as an associate editor of the Reading League.
Holding those editorial positions means she is not just contributing to the research. She is actively evaluating, curating, and guiding the direction of scientific inquiry in the fields of literacy and communication.
She is helping to determine which methodologies actually meet the rigorous standards required for publication.
And the recognition of her work reflects that massive influence.
The awards she has received are definitely not confined to a single specialty. She was awarded the Speech Pathology Australia Fellowship in 2012.
Followed by being granted life membership in 2020.
Yes. And in 2017, she received the Learning Difficulties Australia Mona Tobias Award. She was also selected to deliver the highly prestigious Elizabeth Usher Memorial Lecture in 2015.
Plus, she has received editor's awards for her specific research publications in both 2013 and 2020.
What makes that collection of accolades so fascinating isn't merely the sheer volume of them.
It is the breadth of the institutions awarding them. She is being honored by national bodies governing speech pathology, organizations dedicated to learning difficulties, and academic publishing boards alike.
It serves as concrete proof that her work has successfully dismantled the traditional barriers between these disciplines.
Her research sits at the intersection of psychology, education, and speech pathology, precisely because language itself sits at the intersection of the human experience.
That is a great way to put it. You cannot adequately address a learning difficulty without understanding the cognitive psychology behind it.
And you cannot improve educational outcomes without understanding the mechanics of speech and language.
It really is a remarkable synthesis of disciplines. We started this deep dive looking at Pamela Clare Snow's early work studying severe brain injuries in the 1990s.
Where she built that unique foundation as both a registered psychologist and a speech pathologist.
Right. And we examined how she took those clinical insights regarding human vulnerability and strategically positioned them within the School of Education at La Trobe University.
Fundamentally changing how teachers understand the science of reading.
Then we explored the sobering reality of her research into the justice system, uncovering how an undiagnosed language processing deficit can easily mimic defiance, accelerating a vulnerable adolescent's path into the courtroom.
And finally, we analyzed her fierce public advocacy. From challenging pseudoscientific programs to translating dense cognitive science for parents and teachers through the Snow Report.
The through line of her entire career seems to be the democratization of communication.
Absolutely. Whether she's analyzing an interrogation transcript or advocating for systematic phonics instruction in a primary school, the core message remains perfectly consistent.
The ability to comprehend and articulate language is not a luxury.
It is a fundamental human right that dictates an individual's ability to navigate society safely.
So what does this all mean? It really emphasizes that learning to read is the ultimate protective shield a child can have in life. Thank you for joining us as we mapped out this vital research. As always, the goal is to take these insights and view the world through a slightly sharper lens.
And as we conclude this deep dive, I want you to consider how these principles apply beyond the classroom or the courtroom. Next time you see a teenager struggling to express themselves or acting out, ask yourself,
Are they just refusing to cooperate?
or are they trapped in a world that assumes they have the linguistic tools to navigate it, when in reality, they were never given the blueprint?
That is a fascinating lens to apply to everyday interactions. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep digging into your sources, and stay curious.
We will catch you on the next deep dive.